Hello, and welcome to the Unseen Question. The Bible is full of rules, commands, and stories that are often treated as sacred wisdom. Yet if you take them literally, they reveal a picture that's not just strange, but sometimes deeply troubling. Today we're going to walk through 100 of the most outrageous, bizarre, and unsettling things the Bible expects people to believe or obey. Taken at face value, these passages aren't harmless. They reflect a worldview that shaped entire cultures and still influences laws and politics today. Let's begin with some of the most infamous. The Bible says that a man was commanded by God to sacrifice his own son as a test of loyalty. Think about that. The ultimate demand of violence against your child, framed as an act of faith. If taken literally, it's a story that celebrates obedience over morality and submission over compassion. Another rule says you must not wear clothes made of mixed fabrics, wool and linen in the same outfit. That's considered sinful, entirely trivial in the modern world, but treated as divine instruction in the text. Then there's the rule about rebellious children. According to the Bible, if a son is stubborn and disobedient, his parents are supposed to take him before the town elders, and the people of the community are to stone him to death. That's not metaphor, that's a direct command. Imagine a society where teenage rebellion is punished with execution. The Bible also describes slavery as normal and acceptable. It lays out instructions for how to buy slaves, how long to own them, and even how harshly they can be beaten. It distinguishes between Hebrew slaves and foreign slaves, giving more rights to one than the other. It doesn't abolish slavery, it regulates it, as if ownership of other humans is just part of the natural order. Another strange command: don't eat shellfish, shrimp, crab, lobster, all considered an abomination. Eating pork is forbidden too. Meanwhile, locusts are acceptable. The list of approved versus banned foods feels arbitrary, but is treated as divine law. The Bible insists that women remain silent in church. It says that if they want to learn something, they should ask their husbands at home. That instruction reduces women to passive listeners rather than active participants. Taken literally, it strips away half the population's voice in matters of faith. Another command tells women they must cover their heads when praying, while men must not. The obsession with gender rules and appearances reveals how the text micromanages daily life, embedding control in the smallest details. There's also the story of a prophet being mocked by children. He curses them, and a bear comes out of the woods and kills 42 of them. This is supposed to be a lesson about respecting authority, but when taken literally, it portrays a deity who endorses extreme violence over petty insults. The Bible also treats disease as spiritual punishment. Lepers are cast out, treated as unclean, and forced to shout warnings as they walk. Instead of medical care, the text offers ritual cleansing with bird blood and sacrifices. Taken literally, illness is treated as moral failure instead of a medical condition. Another law says that if a woman is not a virgin on her wedding night, she should be stoned to death at her father's doorstep. The burden of proof falls entirely on the woman. The obsession with sexual control, purity, and violence is hard to overlook when read literally. The Bible even commands people not to plant two different crops in the same field. It seems small, but it's part of the same pattern. Divine authority regulating farming choices as if mixed agriculture is somehow immoral. And then there's the story of Noah's Ark. God floods the entire earth, killing every man, woman, child, and animal except for a single family. Taken literally, it's global genocide, a disaster framed as justice. Yet this story is taught to children as a bedtime tale, stripped of its brutal implications. The text also describes how women who are suspected of adultery should be forced to drink a bitter water potion given by a priest. If they're guilty, their belly will swell and their thigh will rot. That's the ancient equivalent of a supernatural lie detector test. Cruel, humiliating, and completely unscientific. There's even a passage that condones selling your daughter as a servant. She doesn't leave as other servants do, but can be kept and given as a wife to her master or his son. The text treats daughters as property. Another law says that anyone who works on the Sabbath, even picking up sticks, must be put to death. That's how far the obsession with ritual obedience goes. A man was actually executed in the Bible for this exact crime. The Bible also commands people not to make any images of anything in heaven or on earth. That would technically forbid every piece of religious art, every painting, even photography. Taken literally, almost every church building violates this law. In another story, God strikes down a couple, Ananias and Sapphira, for lying about money they donated. It's not just punishment, it's execution for dishonesty, a chilling example of control by fear. The Bible treats mental illness as possession by demons. People aren't given compassion or treatment. They're cast out or subjected to exorcisms. When taken literally, it reinforces stigma. instead of understanding. It also describes polygamy as normal for men of status. Solomon supposedly had hundreds of wives and concubines. These were treated as rewards, not as individual human beings with lives and dignity. There's a command that if two men are fighting and the wife of one intervenes by grabbing the other man's genitals, her hand must be cut off. No. Pity is to be shown. Taken literally, it's another example of extreme, cruel, and deeply bizarre regulation of human behavior. The Bible also tells people to kill witches. That's not symbolic. It's a direct command. Those words were used in history to justify torture, burnings, and executions. These are just a fraction of the 100, but they already reveal the problem. When taken literally, the Bible isn't a book of timeless wisdom. It's a book of dangerous, arbitrary, and often brutal commands. And yet many believers insist that every word is sacred. They treat these passages as the foundation of morality, law, and culture. The contradictions are rarely addressed, the cruelty often ignored, the absurdity brushed aside. When you stack these rules and stories one after another, the picture becomes clear. A text that demands blind obedience, prioritizes control over compassion, and calls for violence in the name of holiness. As we go through more of these 100 commands and stories, the question becomes unavoidable. If this book were written today and presented as a guide for society, would anyone accept it as moral? Or would people recognize it for what it is, a collection of primitive laws and myths that reflect human fears, power struggles, and attempts at control? Let's keep going. Another literal instruction in the Bible says that anyone who curses their parents must be put to death, not punished, not corrected, killed. There's no nuance, no second chance, just execution for words spoken in anger. That's the level of severity baked into these laws. Then there's the rule about menstruating women. According to the Bible, when a woman has her period, she's considered unclean for 7 days. Anything she touches becomes unclean. Anyone who touches her becomes unclean. Even after her period ends, she must make a sacrifice before being allowed back into normal life. It turns a natural biological process into a source of shame and exclusion. Another strange law says that if a man dies without children, his brother must marry the widow and have children in his brother's name. The woman doesn't get a choice. Her life is decided by lineage, not love. The Bible also tells people to stone anyone caught committing adultery, both man and woman. It's not a metaphor. It's public execution by rocks, for an act that today would be considered a personal failing, not a capital crime. There's also the idea that childbirth makes a woman unclean. But interestingly, she's considered twice as unclean if she gives birth to a girl instead of a boy. That detail says a lot about how the text values gender. The Bible commands that people who gather together to worship any other god must be destroyed. Men, women, children, even livestock. Entire towns wiped out for having a different religion. When taken literally, this is divine endorsement of genocide. Another passage tells men to grow beards and not trim the edges. Shaving becomes a violation of divine law. It's one of many purity rules that have no moral basis, just arbitrary control over appearance. Then there's a command that if someone is raped in a city and doesn't scream loud enough, she's to be killed along with the man, because her silence is seen as consent. The cruelty of this law is almost unbearable when taken literally. It punishes the victim for the violence done to her. The Bible also commands that homosexual acts be punished by death. That one verse has caused centuries of suffering, persecution, and self-hatred. Even though it reflects an ancient tribal view of purity, many still cite it as divine truth. Another passage instructs followers not to eat meat that still has blood in it. A strange fixation, but it shows how superstition was wrapped in divine language to control even diet and cooking methods. Then there's the law that forbids touching the skin of a dead pig, which, if taken literally, would mean no football, no leather shoes, no handling pork products. Yet somehow that one gets ignored, while others are enforced. Another strange one. The Bible calls for cutting off a woman's hand if she intervenes in a fight in the wrong way. There's no mercy, no proportionality, just mutilation as justice. There's a command that anyone who practices fortune-telling, astrology, or sorcery must be killed. These laws were once used to justify burning people alive for supposed witchcraft, and their roots lie right here in literal interpretation. Then there's the rule about priests. They can't have any physical defect, no blindness, no limp, no deformity, otherwise they're not allowed to serve. It's discrimination written into divine law, treating physical difference as spiritual impurity. The Bible also says you can't eat animals with cloven hooves that don't chew cud, so pigs are out, camels too, but locusts are fine. The logic behind these dietary restrictions is completely absent. It's ritual purity disguised as morality. Another passage commands believers to destroy idols, smash altars, and burn sacred trees of other religions. That's not tolerance. It's eradication of difference. There's a command that says no one born of illegitimate birth can enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. In other words, children are punished for circumstances they had no control over. Another bizarre story tells of a man named Jephthah who vows to sacrifice whatever comes out of his house first. If God gives him victory in battle, he wins, and his daughter walks out to greet him, so he sacrifices her. That's presented as faithfulness, not horror. Then there's the command to kill anyone who tries to convince others to follow a different God. Even if it's your brother, your son, your daughter, or your wife, you're told not to spare them. That's religious totalitarianism, written in ancient ink. The Bible also demands that anyone who has sex before marriage must marry the person they slept with. No exceptions, no consent needed, no regard for compatibility. Another passage says that when a woman is raped in the countryside, only the man should be killed because she couldn't scream for help. The law literally assumes a woman's guilt or innocence based on geography. There's a story where God sends venomous snakes to punish people for complaining about food. People die in agony until a bronze serpent is made to heal them. It's a supernatural tantrum, not moral teaching. Then there's a command that says animals who mate with humans must be killed, and the person too. It's framed as cleansing the land, as though death itself fixes impurity. The Bible describes how God hardened Pharaoh's heart during the plagues, meaning Pharaoh had no free will, yet God punished him for his disobedience anyway. Taken literally, it's a moral contradiction, a deity creating disobedience just to punish it. There's also the rule that if someone accidentally kills another person, they can flee to a city of refuge, but if they leave it, anyone can kill them without guilt. It turns justice into geography. Another passage forbids tattoos. The same text that permits slavery and child marriage draws the line at body ink. There's also a rule that says any prophet or dreamer who predicts something that doesn't happen should be killed. Imagine if that were enforced today. The entire world of televangelists would vanish overnight. The Bible also treats the earth as the unmoving center of the universe. The sun and moon are described as objects moving across the sky. It's a view of reality, frozen in pre-scientific ignorance. There's a passage that says it's shameful for a man to have long hair, but honorable for a woman. Again, divine concern for hairstyles. Micromanagement mistaken for morality. Another strange detail. If a man suspects his wife of cheating, he can take her to a priest for the bitter water test. But there's no equivalent law for unfaithful husbands. The imbalance is obvious. There's also a passage that describes God commanding his followers to slaughter every man, woman, and child in enemy nations, to leave none alive, including infants. That's not justice, that's genocide. The text even has a law about mildew. If mold appears in your house, you have to call a priest to inspect it. Not a cleaner, not a repairman, a priest. And if it spreads, the house must be destroyed. That's divine home inspection, 3,000 years before science. Then there's the story of Lot's daughters. After fleeing Sodom, they get there, father drunk, and sleep with him to preserve his family line. This disturbing story is told without moral condemnation. Just another day in biblical history. Another law says that if a man has an emission of semen, he's unclean until evening, and anything he touches becomes unclean. The same idea. Bodily functions treated as spiritual pollution. The Bible also says that the earth will never move, and yet we orbit the sun. This shows how literal interpretation collapses under the weight of reality. There's a verse that says women must not teach or have authority over men. Taken literally, that would disqualify countless teachers, leaders, and thinkers simply because of gender. Another command instructs believers not to eat bread or grain made from new crops until an offering is given, a rule that effectively turned worship into a tax. The text also describes how a man who steals must be sold to pay for his theft. That's indentured servitude, the ancient version of debt slavery. There's a law that says if an ox gores someone to death, the ox must be stoned, and its flesh cannot be eaten. But if the owner knew it was dangerous and didn't restrain it, the owner must be killed too. Divine logic at its most bureaucratic. Then there's a passage where God commands soldiers to take virgin girls as spoils of war. It's written plainly, no metaphor, no apology. Women treated as property, distributed by divine order. And another where God kills David's newborn baby as punishment for David's adultery. Not David, the baby. Innocence punished, guilt ignored. Every one of these examples, from dietary rules to executions, from sexual control to genocide, is treated as sacred truth by those who insist the Bible is literal. Yet Yet when held up to moral reasoning or basic empathy, these same verses crumble. They reveal something uncomfortable. That much of what people call divine law is actually ancient tribal law, born in fear, ignorance, and the desire to control others. When read symbolically, some of these texts can have poetic or cultural value, but taken literally, they justify cruelty, prejudice, and superstition. And here's the real question. Why do so many modern believers pick and choose? They'll quote verses against homosexuality, but ignore the ones banning mixed fabrics. They'll celebrate the 10 Commandments, but forget the hundreds of other laws demanding death for minor offenses. Literal belief turns the Bible into a trap. It demands you defend the indefensible, excuse the inexcusable, and call it faith. What we really see when we take these 100 literal rules and stories together is not timeless truth, but a snapshot of humanity's past, a time when people tried to understand their world through fear, authority, and myth. And maybe that's the most important lesson. Not that the Bible is evil, but that it's human, flawed, inconsistent, and revealing more about us than about any God. Because when we stop taking it literally, when we see it as a record of human struggle instead of divine command, we finally start to learn from it, not obey it. When you step back and look at the whole picture, something becomes clear that most people never question. The Bible doesn't just tell stories, it defines reality for those who take it literally. It builds a world where obedience is more important than conscience, where authority trumps empathy, and where morality is measured not by kindness but by compliance. And that's the real danger, because once someone believes these ancient rules are not just old ideas but absolute truth, it gives permission to stop thinking. It invites people to surrender their judgment, to treat cruelty as duty and ignorance as faith. It replaces curiosity with fear, and fear, when justified by divine command, becomes unstoppable. That's why literal belief matters, not as an academic argument, but as a social one. Because history has shown what happens when sacred texts are taken at face value. The Crusades, the witch hunts, the Inquisitions, the defense of slavery, the persecution of minorities, the subjugation of women, all were justified by quoting verses that were never questioned, never reinterpreted, never doubted. The Bible, taken literally, became a weapon, a shield for those in power, and a cage for those without it. And it's not just ancient history. Even today, laws are written, rights are restricted, and education is censored based on verses from a book that calls for stoning disobedient children and killing people for working on weekends. When you point that out, people often say, those laws don't apply anymore, but they never explain who decided that, or why some laws expired and others didn't. The truth is, literal belief only survives through selective blindness, a quiet agreement to pretend the worst parts aren't really there. That's the hidden contradiction at the heart of fundamentalism. It demands literal faith in a book that no one actually lives by. No one's building arks, stoning neighbors, or refusing to wear blended fabrics. And yet those same people will quote the Bible as if every word is still binding. And this matters because every generation inherits not just beliefs, but the logic that sustains them. When a child is taught that everything in the Bible is true, they aren't just learning stories, they're learning to trust authority over evidence, to accept commands without understanding, to see morality as obedience. That mindset is hard to unlearn. It's why people can read a verse commanding genocide and still call it justice, or read a law demanding death for adultery and still call it holy. Because once something is declared sacred, no matter how absurd or cruel, questioning it becomes sin. Literal interpretation turns myth into law, poetry into policy, and metaphor into moral order. But step back, and the contradictions are obvious. A God who tells people not to kill, then orders them to slaughter entire tribes. A God who calls himself love, then commands execution for trivial disobedience. A moral system that praises humility but glorifies submission. It doesn't add up, and maybe it never did. If the Bible were truly a perfect moral guide, we wouldn't need to reinterpret it every century to keep it humane. That constant reinterpretation is evidence not of divine wisdom, but human evolution. Humanity slowly outgrowing its own ancient beliefs, learning to replace ritual with reason, fear with empathy, and superstition with understanding. The irony is that the best moral progress humanity has made, equality, compassion, freedom of thought, came not from following these literal texts, but from challenging them, from questioning the very idea that morality comes from ancient authority. You can see this tension everywhere. People say the Bible teaches love, but when taken literally, it teaches exclusion. People say it gives moral clarity, but when read carefully, it gives confusion, contradiction, and cruelty. That's why so many quietly cherry-pick, keeping the parts that sound kind and ignoring the rest. Because deep down, most people already know, literal faith doesn't fit with modern conscience. and yet billions still call it the Word of God, not because of evidence, but because it feels safe, familiar, comforting. It's not easy to admit that something you were told was sacred might actually be flawed, but facing that truth is what intellectual honesty looks like. When you strip away the fear of punishment and the promise of reward, what's left is a book that reflects its time, a collection of tribal rules, survival strategies, and myths passed through centuries of power and interpretation. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. It can still show us how people once thought about morality, fear, and the unknown. It can remind us how far we've come and how much further we have to go. Because the moment we stop taking these texts literally, we begin to take responsibility ourselves. We stop outsourcing morality to ancient voices and start defining it through reason, empathy, and evidence. When you do that, you don't need a rule book that tells you what to eat, how to dress, or who to love. You don't need threats of eternal fire to behave decently. You don't need divine permission to care for others. You just need the courage to think for yourself. And maybe that's what all those insane, literal commands unintentionally reveal. Not divine authority, but human insecurity. The desperate need to control chaos by writing. Rules for everything, even the color of fabric, the length of hair, or the shape of a beard. It's almost poetic in a dark way, because those same rules meant to preserve order, ended up trapping minds. And the only way out is the same as it's always been, through questioning, through honesty, through the simple act of asking, does this make sense? Because when you really ask that question, and you mean it, the whole structure begins to shake, and you start to see it for what it is. A human book, written by human hands, filled with human fear, human imagination, and human attempts to understand the universe. There's nothing wrong with that, but pretending it's something more, pretending it's literal truth, that's what keeps humanity from growing. Taking the Bible literally demands you turn off your mind, but reading it critically allows you to turn it back on. And maybe after looking through these 100 commands, rules, and stories, the most insane thing of all isn't what's written in the Bible, it's that so many still believe it must be taken literally. Because every literal believer at some point faces the same quiet moment of realization that the book they've treated as perfect doesn't actually behave like one. The contradictions start to stack up. The morality feels inconsistent. The voice that once sounded divine starts to sound human. And that's not a bad thing, it's just honest. Once you stop insisting that every word is infallible, the Bible transforms from a rule book into a record, a snapshot of humanity trying to make sense of existence, of life, death, suffering, and meaning. It becomes something you can study, critique, and even appreciate without surrendering your mind to it. The problem isn't that people find meaning in Scripture. The problem is when they mistake that meaning for universal truth, or worse, law. Literalism freezes human growth. It says morality was completed thousands of years ago, that we have nothing new to learn, nothing left to question. It traps us in the worldview of ancient tribes who didn't know where lightning came from, how disease spreads, or why the stars move. But the world has changed. We know more now. We understand that diseases aren't curses, that earthquakes aren't punishments, that love isn't sin, and that curiosity isn't rebellion. And yet the moment someone insists the Bible must be taken literally, all of that progress gets pulled backward. Every new discovery, every moral improvement has to fight against words written by people who thought the earth was flat and the universe revolved around it. That's the quiet tragedy of literal faith. It chains the living to the ideas of the dead. When you take the Bible literally, you inherit not just its beauty, but its brutality, not just its poetry, but its prejudice. You inherit a worldview where slavery is normal, women are property, violence is virtue, and questioning is sin. And it's strange, because the people who take it most literally often claim to love truth, yet literalism is what stops them from ever finding it. They'll read a verse about the sun standing still and deny astronomy, a verse about creation and deny biology, a verse about sexuality and deny compassion. Literalism demands you pick between faith and fact, as if truth can't survive examination. But truth doesn't fear questions, only lies do. The world doesn't need more blind obedience to old texts. It needs more courage to face reality, even when it's uncomfortable. Because if morality means anything, it should evolve as we do. It should grow with empathy, expand with understanding, and refine with knowledge, not stay frozen in a Bronze Age manual of tribal law. The Bible, taken literally, tells you to stone your neighbor for picking up sticks, to kill your child for rebellion, to execute your friend for believing differently. But taken symbolically, critically, it can still remind us of how people once wrestled with fear and tried to create order from chaos. The question is whether we want to keep living in that ancient chaos or build something better, And the only way forward is honesty, not about what we wish were true, but about what is. Because the moment you let go of literalism, you stop worshipping words and start valuing meaning. You stop fearing punishment and start understanding responsibility. You stop defending myths and start seeking truth. And that's the shift that changes everything. When people stop taking the Bible literally, they don't lose morality, they reclaim it. They stop obeying because they're afraid and start acting because they care. That's the irony of all these insane commands. They were meant to control people, but by studying them, by understanding where they came from, we actually become freer. Freer to think, freer to question, freer to build morality that fits reality, not mythology. The real story of human progress isn't written in holy books. It's written in what we've learned to leave behind. Every step toward reason, every act of compassion, every new understanding of the universe, all of it has come from breaking the chains of literal belief. And maybe that's the lesson buried underneath it all. The Bible shows us what happens when people confuse authority with truth and truth with fear, but it also shows us what we're capable of overcoming. Because despite everything, the fear, the guilt, the obedience, humanity kept questioning, kept learning, kept reaching beyond the page. So maybe the Bible's greatest value today isn't what it commands, but what it reminds us to question, because the moment we stop taking it literally is the moment we start growing beyond it. And that might just be the most sacred act of all,